Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Not only did we have a big Pixelborn tournament this weekend, but there was also an $8,000 tournament over in the States at Charlie's Collectible Show in Georgia. We're looking at the top 8 decks today, and obviously when we're looking at physical tournaments compared with Pixelborn tournaments, there are a few different things to bear in mind. Players are, of course, limited by their collection, so if you cook up a really exciting deck idea, you might not be able to necessarily even play that deck if you don't have all the cards, and of course you might be limited by budget. So you might just be wanting to play, for example, decks which were good in set 2 and you already had access to. And as a result, we see less deck variety in this top 8 compared with the top 16 from the Pixelborn tournament. But fret not, the meta is wide open. Ruby Amethyst, the first deck we're going to look at. We're going to look at kind of the top 8 players and then look at the first place player last. So we're kind of working in reverse order here. Ruby Amethyst in top 8 here. Minnie Mouse and Olaf. Important to note there's 3 copies of Teeth and Ambitions here, which does seem like a card which Ruby and Amethyst is going to need to play moving forwards. We've seen in both this tournament and in the Pixelborn tournament some aggro decks performing really well, and Teeth and Ambitions is a really important card to have access to if your opponent opens with like a turn 1 Maleficent or Lilo that quests for 2. Being able to put your Minnie Mouse down and then on turn 2, or even play a Kuzco on turn 2 and then sing Teeth and Ambitions on turn 3 is just a huge tempo swing in your favor as a Ruby Amethyst player against those aggro decks, and definitely a card I think that these decks are going to be including moving forwards. We're also still seeing 2 copies of Pinocchio. Pinocchio, a really good tech option to deal with Ursula, Deceiver of All, that Emerald Legendary card, but also other uses, just being able to exert an opponent's Rafiki in the mirror and take this out with no strength is pretty valuable. 2 copies of Dragonfire. We have seen this be more popular as a card, 1 or 2 options. We see 1 copy of Sorcerer's Spellbook. Sorcerer's Spellbook particularly strong in the mirror. 2 Queen's Castles, 2 Merlin's Crabs. Some players deciding not to play locations. Certainly we're seeing less locations overall, so it's interesting to see a few less tech options as well. Overall, very solid looking list, pretty standard. Obviously the ratios really are where the differences are being made, but I do really like the inclusion of Teeth and Ambitions here as well. Up next, another Ruby Amethyst deck looking very, very similar. This one, though, more heavy on the locations of 2 copies of RLS Legacy, 4 copies of the Queen's Castle, and 3 copies of Jim Hawkins. There's also a Yzma in here, which is not something you see every day. Yzma, kind of good spot removal if you don't quite have the ink for a Maleficent, but you can also use Yzma on one of your own cards, like a Merlin's Goat, for example, to draw 2 cards and get some bounce synergy. This one also rocking a couple copies of Teeth and Ambitions, 2 Merlin's Crabs. Pretty similar. The big difference here is going to be that RLS Legacy and Jim Hawkins, as well as the Yzma, compared with like a bit more control on Dragonfire. Also no spellbook in this one, important to note. So the spellbook can be really good in the mirror, but equally the RLS Legacy is going to be pretty terrible in the mirror because it's uninkable. It's pretty awkward to get rid of, and Maui of course can just feast on RLS Legacy. So most players cut Legacy, pretty bad in the mirror. I don't think I would play it personally. Also not a huge fan of Jim Hawkins overall. Maybe like 1 copy of Jim Hawkins for a few locations could be interesting. Locations are interesting because there's some board states they're really, really good, but there's other board states they suck and you just want to ink them. And I think Jim Hawkins is good, but a card that I would only play 2 copies of, maybe 1 if it was me. I'm not a Ruby Amethyst gamer though myself. Another Ruby Amethyst, I promise there is a bit of variety in this video. More Ruby Amethyst. Again, it's the most affordable meta deck really at the moment. It's just got very solid matchups, but it didn't win the tournament. Spoiler alert, it didn't win either of the tournaments this weekend. Olaf, Rafiki, Kuzco, pretty standard stuff. We see the Pinocchio in there. 1 spellbook as well. 1 copy of Lady Tremaine. Lady Tremaine, definitely a card I'm a big fan of. 1 Yzma, no Jim Hawkins in this one. Very, very similar list, just a few differences. And guess what's next? That's right, more Ruby Amethyst, but this one is looking quite a bit different with a bit more of an aggressive take here on Ruby Amethyst. Only 2 copies of Be Prepared. Wow. So this is like not an aggro deck, but certainly a more mid-range style of Ruby Amethyst with the Pascal, the Chernobog's followers for early questing potential. Ursula's Cauldron is an interesting one. Quite a slow card, but gives you a lot of consistency. A card I do quite like, honestly. But the 3 copies of Minnie Mouse also show you that this is a deck that's trying to be more aggressive. The problem that Minnie Mouse has in set 3 is lots of players playing Maui's Fishhook. Maui's Fishhook being able to give Maui Evasive just means that this Minnie Mouse can get removed very, very quickly indeed. However, of course, it's inkable. So in a deck against, and when you're playing it against Maui's Fishhook, you can ink this Minnie Minnie Mouse. And even Minnie Mouse still on turn 3 is still pretty powerful, right? It's going to mean that your opponent is not able to remove your Minnie Mouse for a couple of turns. If they play Maui's Fishhook on turn 3 and then Maui on 5, the Fishhook on 3 is pretty slow overall. And you're probably going to have board control by that point, and then you might be able to punish them. So I actually do like the inclusion of Minnie Mouse, maybe 2 or 3 rather than all 4. But this is a really interesting take on Ruby Amethyst, a little bit more aggressive. And finally, we have something that's not Ruby Amethyst. In fact, the top 4, there's only one Ruby Amethyst deck in the mixer. So up first, we have in the top 4, Steel Songs by Christian K. I'm not sure if there was a third place playoff in this one, but certainly top 4. So Amber Steel Songs. This one does have the Rockstar Stitch. In fact, this looks like a net deck almost. It's not a net deck, but it looks very, very similar to the deck that won the Pixelborn tournament 2 weeks ago by DeCandio. Quite a lot of weird ratios in this one, which I don't like the look of. Like only 3 copies of Tinkerbell. Just play 4 Tinkerbells, please, for the love of all that is holy. 3 Cinderellas, 2 Surfer Stitch. I do love the little Chernabog in there, though. Chernabog, as a one-off, I think is optimal in these Steel Song decks. Because you're playing Whole New World, you're dumping lots of card into the graveyard. The Chernabog can very, very quickly be a 0-cost card. The other thing that a lot of people overlook with Chernabog is because when you play Chernabog, it adds loads of characters back from your discard into your deck. In matchups where your opponent is threatening to mill you, which happens very easy in a deck where you have Storm Rage on, Whole New World, Beast, Surfer Stitch, Rockstar Stitch, Aerial. So much card draw in this deck, you can get milled very easily if you don't quest quickly enough. But Chernabog can just reverse that by putting like 20 cards back into the deck, maybe more like 10, 15 is more realistic. But if you have a Chernabog which costs 0, that's minimum 10 characters you're putting back into the deck, which is adding 10 cards more to your deck and can be the difference in a game where your opponent's trying to mill you. So a card I'm a big fan of in these decks. Overall, list looks good. I don't like the Rockstar Stitch, as I'm sure you guys know from my my past chats. There was a tournament winning deck in the Pixelborn deck, a second place deck that was playing Amber Steel Songs in the Pixelborn tournament, which didn't have the Rockstar Stitch, and I did like the look of that list a little bit more. And spoiler alert, there's another Amber Steel Songs in this tournament, which I also preferred the look of. Up next, we have a very spicy deck by Zach Bivens, who's a pretty well-known Lorcana player. They took an aggro deck to this weekend's tournament and finished in the top 4. And this is a deck I really like the look of. It's really exciting. I also played aggro this weekend in my Pixelborn tournament. There was a couple aggro decks performing really well that got top 4. We seen the top 4 in the Pixelborn tournament. We saw a Emerald Amethyst aggro deck, which is similar to what I played, but we also saw in the top 4 a Steel Amethyst deck, very similar to Zach's here. So a common theme here, Amethyst being the aggro deck of choice, and then it's really deciding what to pair with it. So Emerald gives you more coverage against Steel, for example, with access to Ursula discard, but what Steel gives you brute force bodyguards. So worse against, for example, Steel, but going to be better against everything else. So you've got Chernabog's followers, Maleficent as your turn 1s, or Olaf, lots of 1-drops here. And then on turn 2, depending on what your opponent does, you're looking to go Madam Mim to bounce something back, or Mr. Smee Pinocchio for more aggression. Couple copies of Arthur. The other deck that made it to the Pixelborn top 4 was, I think, playing 4 copies of Arthur still. Now, Hercules over Kidder is a really interesting decision, and I've been trying to work it out. Kidder, if you're not familiar, is a 2-cost card, very comparable to Simba. In fact, it's identical to Simba, but in Steel. Now, what the Hercules gives you is it gives you 1 more strength, which means that if a Madam Mim, either Snake or Fox, tries to remove this bodyguard, they are also going to be removed from the board themselves. Whereas if you have a Kidder protecting your stuff, the Madam Mim, Fox, or Snake remain on the board, which is pretty problematic. Another card I love in this deck, and is a big reason I think to play Steel, is this Prince card. Prince Bodyguard basically has 4 health with its resist and conquest for 2. Very, very aggressive. There's also Merlins, Merlin Goat, Merlin Rabbit. The Strength of a Raging Fighter is really interesting because you're going super wide with this deck. This card could give you like 5 removal for just 3 ink, and you could sing it with your Madam Mim Fox, with your Maleficent, with your Hercules. Pretty spicy inclusion, actually. Not something I've seen before. 1 copy of Spellbook, 4 goats, 4 rabbits, 3 Pinocchios. Befuddle, also a pretty aggressive card. Not honestly one I've been a big fan of in my own testing of aggro decks, but this one is super, super aggressive. Not really looking to get into the mid game, looking to win very quickly. It is probably just going to fall to Steel, though. I think this deck will just lose to Steel. Wouldn't really be a deck I recommend playing moving forwards. I think Zach would agree that there was just a lot of Ruby Sapphire coming into this weekend where Ruby Sapphire was seemingly the top deck in the meta, but lots of decks then were teched to beat Ruby Sapphire. And that's why we saw kind of an upsurge in aggro here. Now, top 2, second place, losing in the final, the last Ruby Amethyst deck of the top 8 review. And this one is a little bit different. It's pretty aggressive with the Churner Box Followers, a card I'm a huge fan of. We don't see, though, those mini mouses. We don't then see those teeth and ambitions. So this deck is one that would probably struggle more against aggro, for example. However, Lady Tremaine in the mixer, a card I adore, and lots of people have been cutting Lady Tremaines. Really excited to see 4 copies of her, 4 copies of Medusa, the Be Prepared, the Maleficent as all the top end, and then the rest, no locations, they've dropped those entirely, which I think is a pretty interesting idea. If you're playing against Steel, for example, they still have to fear your Queen's Castle, they might have to hold that Rise of the Titans in their hand, but then you just never play one, and that can make things quite awkward. 1 copy of Spellbook is nice in the mirror. No mini mouses in this one. But yeah, the Tremaines, just to give you that extra bit of control. This deck looks very clean to me. Again, I think one thing this deck might struggle with is against aggro decks not having access to that Olaf mini teeth and ambitions play. But apart from that, I love the look of it. Okay, finally, the tournament winning deck, and it is Amber Steel. And this is a deck very similar looking to the deck which got second place in Tia's Pixelborn tournament as well. Now, there's 2 main lines of this one, which is the early game plan you play. Well, you have 3 really good 1-drops. No Rockstar Stitch. Oh my goodness, I love the look of this deck already. On turn 1, you play Cinderella, Robin Hood, or Queen. These are all really good aggressive cards. The Cinderella is threatening Storm Rage on turn 2, which is incredibly powerful. It's threatening Bare Necessities on turn 2 as well, which could be great against someone playing 1 jump ahead, for example, or someone playing Fishbone Quill, because you can discard Fishbone Quill with Bare Necessities as well. Alternatively, if you go the Queen on turn 2, you're threatening the Queen shift on turn 2 into a whole new world on turn 2. Imagine you're going second against a Sapphire Steel player that's looking to get Fishbone Quill down on turn 3. Then you have so many disruption options with Cinderella, Bare Necessities on turn 2, or with the Queen into Queen shift into whole new world to discard their whole hand. Being able to do that either side of the coin is really good. What we see a lot of the time from these wheel decks is when they're going first, they play Robin Hood on turn 1, Robin Hood on turn 3, and then singing a whole new world, because that's before the, for example, Sapphire Steel player is able to get their Fishbone Quill down. However, if the Sapphire Steel player is going first, they can play Fishbone Quill on turn 3 before you're able to shift Robin Hood in and sing. But with this deck, with the Queen, you've got a really good disruption option even when you're going second with Cinderella, Bare Necessities as well. So it does look like the Queen, Robin Hood, Sing Song is the way to build this deck. Now, the Benja is also really interesting. I think it's a really good meta for Benja. Lots of the decks in Tia's tournament, for example, we saw Sapphire Steel winning it, have Lucky Dime in the mixer. Benja going to be really good against those more greedy decks. We've seen lots of Sorcerer's Spellbooks. We're seeing Sleepy's Flutes. The meta slowed down a bit because of Ruby Sapphire, and these decks are really aimed at being good into Ruby Sapphire as well as just being good into everything else. If there's one card I'm not a huge fan of in this deck, it's World's Greatest Criminal Mind. Banished character with 5 strength or more, but it's an inkable song. Pretty interesting. Obviously, lots of people are scared of dealing with Medusa at the moment, so maybe there's a few more characters with 5 strength or more. If you actually look at the game, there's not that many characters this can hit, but it can hit cards like Cinderella. If we look at Ruby Amethyst, it could hit Maui, it could hit Maleficent. Being able to remove a Maui for 3 costs is quite interesting, to be fair. Also Cinderella in mirror matchups. But if you look at like other cards, even Surface Stitch is only at 4 strength. There's not that many cards you're actually hitting with this. So pretty interesting to see it in the mixer. But definitely good against Maleficent, good against Cinderella, good against Maui to an extent. There's also 3 copies of Hades here. Now what Hades gives you is it gives you a little bit of coverage against discard decks. Emerald decks can give this deck a run for its money. If you are able to discard the whole new world with Ursula early on, then this deck's game plan can kind of fall apart if you're not able to sing a whole new world early on. But Hades gives you like a little bit of extra coverage. Maybe if your Ariel gets removed, you could put Ariel back into your hand, search out for a song. Maybe if you are looking for some more card draw, only 1 Rapunzel in here, worth noting as well. We're used to seeing a few more. But overall, I really like the look of this deck. Really exciting way to build Amber Songs. I think Amber Steel Songs is in a really good place in this meta and still being underestimated by quite a lot of players. So, after having looked at the top 8 from this weekend and also the top 8 from Pixelborn this weekend, we can see that the meta is wide open. Amber Steel Songs had a good showing in both. Aggro decks also had a really good showing. Ruby and Amethyst obviously did pretty well. Sapphire Steel topped the Pixelborn tournament as well. Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire all looking pretty good, but there's lots of room for experimentation. I would now expect, the meta's going quite quick now in order to be able to beat Ruby Sapphire. I would expect Steel to make a bit of a comeback to deal with these lowly questers. If you imagine this Amber Steel Songs deck against a more top heavy deck, for example, with this one doesn't even play Tinkerbells, I just realized. Oh my goodness. So imagine a deck, a Sapphire Steel deck against this with Tinkerbell Grab Your Swords, right? I think Sapphire Steel is kind of the deck to beat at the moment, honestly, which was the tournament winning deck from the Pixelborn tournament. And we saw in the final a deck very similar to this get obliterated by that Sapphire Steel deck. I have a deck guide on Sapphire Steel coming with the Pixelborn tournament winner very, very soon. So that's probably coming out later today, maybe tomorrow as well. I'm interviewing Sky, who topped the Pixelborn tournament, and I think that might be the deck to beat. Super excited about the Disney Lorcana meta though overall. It is so wide open. Aggro looks good. Steel looking good. Everything looks good, mate. There's not really a bad deck around. The meta is still wide open. No one actually knows what the best deck is still. Each week it's kind of flip-flopping. We thought coming into this weekend it was Ruby Sapphire, but the meta has adapted by playing a more slow game plan with cards like CP's Flute, but then also that's opened up some more aggressive opening plays like this Shift Queen and then this kind of aggro approach as well. And even this... we saw one kind of pretty aggressive Ruby Amethyst deck, which is going to be aimed at beating this Ruby Sapphire deck, which we didn't even see in the top 8 here, but we did see a lot of Ruby and Sapphire in the top 16 of the Pixelborn tournament. But anyway, this was really fun to look at the top 8 from this $8,000 tournament in Georgia. Going to keep covering these decks, and probably in a few days, once everything's settled down a bit more, I'll do another meta report or like another chat about the whole meta, kind of looking at both this tournament, looking at the Pixelborn tournament, seeing where I think the meta's going, what's best. But what I love about the meta at the moment, it's so fluid, it's changing every week. It's really, really insane how well balanced this game is, and I am loving it. So basically my TLDR is keep experimenting, ladies and gentlemen. There is a lot of wiggle room to experiment and create some new exciting decks. And yeah, have fun, because look, if you can predict what the meta is and play like a saucy version of a deck, don't just net deck. You have to kind of read what the meta is looking like. And in my opinion, it might be time for Emerald Steel discard. I really think it might be time. Problem with Emerald Steel is that it has a terrible matchup into Ruby Sapphire. And this weekend, for example, in my tournament, I played against 4 Ruby Sapphire players out of 8 games. So I couldn't bring Emerald Steel, but if everyone's building their decks to be good into Ruby Sapphire now, which it seems like they are because Ruby Sapphire struggled overall this weekend, maybe it's time for Emerald Steel to shine. Because I think Emerald Steel can give this deck, this deck, this deck, this deck, Ruby, as well as Sapphire Steel a run for their money. I'm praying it's time for Emerald Steel, ladies and gentlemen, but maybe I'm still just dreaming. But thanks so much for watching. Love the meta, love the game. Appreciate you. See you soon. I need a podcast, don't I? I need a podcast. I just want to keep talking Lorcana. Take care. Bye.